to do this. It is because the Western Region Board, under the presidency of Christine Hoffman, decided that our members are actually in a very unique position right now to affect social change. And with the things going on in the workplace and in our society in general, it's very helpful to get as much information as we can so that we can react appropriately as the HR professionals that we are in the workplace and be part of the solution rather than be part of the problem. So because of that, Brian Haggerty and I, who are your co-chairs for the Professional Development Committee for the Western Region, thought that this would be a good idea to start these conversations. And today we have Viva Asmalash and our three panelists who are HR professionals in our field right now who can speak to the issues and start the conversations. So without further ado, I'd like to give you Viva, and just another reminder, if you haven't yet and you just joined us and you joined us a little bit late, please turn off your cameras and turn off your microphones as well. There will be an opportunity for questions, so please use the chat rooms. I will be monitoring that, and if you have any further questions, you can ask that at the question and answer portion of the presentation. Oh, and one more thing, we are also taping this webinar so that it can be shared with our other professionals, other HR professionals, so that we can share the knowledge. So without further ado, Eva.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here so we can begin the presentation portion of our panel. I am so excited to be here with all of you today, and we have some excellent panelists that are here with tons of experience and insights to share on the topics that we're going to get into for the next hour. So obviously, as Andrea was mentioning, these are really, really important topics. We are all feeling, to varying degrees, feeling the weight and the urgency around really making sure that we keep ourselves informed and up to date. So as we get into this, I just want to share a little bit about myself. My name is Viva Asmalash. I'm an Associate Director of People Operations and an inclusion consultant and strategist. I have over 12 years experience in people operations, recruiting, employer branding, employee engagement, and DEI strategy, internally within organizations. And so I really am passionate about the topics that we're going to talk about, as I know we all are. And I want to really ground us in why it's so important that HR professionals in particular are feeling really strongly rooted and prepared in getting into these topics and in supporting people through these very complex areas. HR, I always like to say HR is really the moral compass within any organization. And it's so, so important. We can only really judge ourselves on the ways that we protect the most vulnerable and the most marginalized within our society. That's my belief, and in particular within our workforce. So we really need to be thinking about who we're here to protect and honor and serve, and are our processes and our actions really doing that, and are we holding ourselves to those values? So that's what we're going to get into today. As Andrea mentioned, please use the chat function. We will try to take a couple of questions throughout, but we have a lot of stuff to get to, and we'll definitely do our best to leave some time at the end of the presentation as well to take some questions. I just also want to say, if we don't get to everyone's question, that's okay. It's all right, because you're going to have more opportunities. This is not the first, or excuse me, this is not the last time that IPMA is going to be offering some avenues to discuss. So with that, let's go ahead and introduce our, one more thing before we get to introducing our panelists. One of them, the amazing Kara, who you'll meet in just a moment if you haven't already met her, gave us this incredible lens to think about our discussion today. A true American hero, Representative John Lewis, we lost him very recently, but he left us with this idea of good trouble and this quote: "Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. necessary trouble. And that's what we're talking about today. Not just accepting the status quo as it is, but really pushing the boundaries of what might be possible, because the world right now really needs that of us. It requires that of us. So that's the lens and the energy that we want to bring to today's discussion. And with that, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. So first we have Jennifer Fairweather. Jennifer is the Director of Human Resources for Jefferson County. She's also an affiliate business and econ professor with Regis University and has over 23 years experience across both the public and the private sector for human resources, in addition to operational and management experience. So we're so excited to have you with us, Jennifer. We also have Risa Williams. So Risa is an HR business partner for the city of Portland. So we'll definitely have some great insights to share on what's happening in Portland right now and how that's impacting the workforce. And is a certified human resources and benefits professional, 15+ years experience in nonprofit, private, and public sectors, and really cares deeply about leadership making a positive difference within the organization and the community it serves. So I hope you're getting as excited as I am to hear what all these amazing people have to say. We also have Kara Woodson-Welch, who is the Executive Director of IPMA-HR. Kara has 30 years of experience in association management and leadership and is a member of the DC Bar Association. Most recently was General Counsel at World at Work, and prior to that served as General Counsel and VP of Advocacy at the Design Build Institute of America in Washington, DC. And so again, I'm just feel really honored and humbled to share space with all of you today and to get into some of the topics that we have here. I also have to share, their bios are much longer than this. We just didn't have enough time to get into all of the amazing work that they've already done and are doing now. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I would love to just open it up with really creating space for candor and honesty. And there are some, again, difficult and complex issues for us to get into, but I think that this is a really good place for us to start. I would love to hear from all of our panelists, we talk about values a lot as organizations, but what's one big truth that your organization has had to confront when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that does or doesn't show up as a core organizational value? So how do you see DEI efforts really being represented or connected to core values? And you can go ahead and go for it, whoever's ready to share.
I can share, I guess.
Great, thanks, Jennifer.
Sure, good afternoon. So yes, one of our core values is inclusivity. And one thing I think that's been hard for some individuals in our organization is, people who work there and people who live there will say, everyone is so nice. It's so nice to work here. People are always nice. People always speak to you. Everything's great. And I think what happens is people, put a lens on that is rose-colored. People like to bury their head in the sand and deny and not admit that maybe that nicety can often cover up things that aren't nice. And so I think that truth for us really came to manifest when we did some listen and learn sessions that were just open to all employees. And some of our employees shared some experiences that they had working for the county. And I think there were people who were absolutely shocked. Some people were hurt. Like it had nothing to do with them, but they were just hurt that coworkers had experienced those things that I think they really were in denial about that happened in that community. Because again, it has that facade of everything is nice, and it is nice, and people are nice. But nice doesn't mean that you're being inclusive of everyone. Nice often means you're not speaking up when you should speak up. Nice may mean that you minimize or ignore comments and you don't confront them. So I think that's probably one of the biggest truths that I recognize very quickly that came to light when we did some of our listen and learn sessions.
That's so relevant, Jennifer, to what we were just talking about with good trouble, right? Avoiding into that good trouble by just kind of maintaining the status quo, usually in ways that protect the majority, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I think one of the other big truths is that it's really difficult to examine your own unconscious biases and to recognize that that is something that we all have to some degree or another. And that doesn't necessarily show up in a formal diversity and inclusion statement, although it's obviously the foundation of one, but really looking at that and examining the microaggressions that I think Jennifer was just mentioning, but also just your own, everyone has their own unconscious bias, and really looking at that and figuring out what lens have I been looking through that may be making it difficult for some of my colleagues.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. I feel like that's something that really does hinder true progress because people are fighting against the current, and the sooner we can all get to a place of sort of accepting that as just being a fact, right? Unconscious bias, in many ways, it's important. We develop that as people to protect us and to keep us safe. But we need to understand what those are so we can just have greater awareness around that. Yeah, very true. Risa, do you have thoughts on this?
I definitely do. Yeah, for me now, being in the city of Portland, of course, the biggest truth that this area has had to confront is the history. Portland has a very unique and interesting history that issues of diversity and equity and inclusion are now at the forefront of what's happening in terms of demands for social justice. Oregon as a state has a history of excluding people of color just to live in the state and to be able to own housing and do certain things. And so a lot of that history we find has been rooted in the policies, the processes, and the systematic way that the city itself administers just its daily operations. And so over time, it's recognized, right? It's been recognized that there is some disparity. However, right now, there is a strong demand for action. There's an urgent demand to take action, to make changes. And so that's where we are. We've made some changes. There's been some diversity, but probably not enough, admittedly. And the other challenge is, of course, you can have diversity, you can bring people into a public organization, but you also have to have the mechanism of inclusion that's a part of that process to actually retain a diverse staff of employees.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. You know, when we had an opportunity to all connect, you know, last week and chat about our time together a little bit. One of the things that came up was really thinking about what are those core company or organizational values, right? And is there a connection being made between that and what we're talking about here with diversity and equity? Normally, a lot of organizations have a value around, you know, collaboration. We're true partners, or we're a family that cares about each other. But how is that being translated into some of the things that we're talking about here? And I'm wondering what you all think, whoever would like to answer this, what a couple barriers are to that, particularly in the public sector, because I think that there are really unique challenges with everyone that's listening today, you know, around making change and what that might feel like. So any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that has been very difficult in the public sector, and I'm coming more from a national point of view, you know, looking at the overall area of, you know, local, state, and federal, has been the somewhat slow pace of the development of policies in the public sector because there's such public scrutiny over what the public sector is doing. So one of the things that we have been really trying to do at the national level, try to provide more resources so people can share those policies and programs. We have a page on our website racial equity resources where you can post some of your policies and programs so that you get that peer-to-peer sharing with each other, because it can be really difficult to try to start and really make the changes you need to make to have this happen, particularly in the public sector, because you have more stakeholders than you would necessarily in a private company where you can sometimes just pivot and say, this is what we're going to do. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as being one of the barriers that I see that can be difficult.
Very true.
I think this is Jennifer. So I think other barriers, and that's a really important one. And along those same lines, lack of resources for many public sector entities. So you're fighting for, in many cases, resources to do kind of some core function type things to actually serve the community. And then it can be difficult. And we know you can make the business case to put funds towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not that, but it can be a hard business case when you're competing with the other demands that go on in government around public health and safety. And so that's always a struggle. I think also because many public sector organizations have continual change in leadership and report to elected leaders, the benchmarks and the philosophy and the passion around it is always a moving target, depending on who is elected. And so sometimes you might be starting at square one to build that case, and sometimes you've got someone who comes in and they're already there and they're way ahead of you. So you're always working within that, and it's always shifting. And it is, I think, somewhat disheartening for us in human resources that at times it can feel like this whole topic area can be somewhat politicized, and I think that's unfortunate. We don't want it to be a political discussion that if you're on this side, you should embrace it, and if you're on this side, you shouldn't, because we all want to embrace it. And so I think, especially right now, it's one of those things we're really trying to keep out of that realm of political and government sector, but it can easily get there. And I know colleagues are dealing with that right now. And so I think that can be a struggle for many of us who do this work.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just want to reinforce a couple things that I heard. Our hope today is really to leave you all with some takeaways and some actions. And I think the one that Kara mentioned around, creating greater transparency on your website and inviting people along on your journey, even if you're just starting out. I think people would rather know where you are and have some insight into that versus no insight at all or acting like it doesn't exist. And then to Jennifer's point, really continuing to remind people that the word human is the core of human resources, right? And so how do you continue to kind of spotlight the humanity of it versus the issues being politicized? Risa, you look like you had something to add.
I did. So just from a different perspective within human resources, I think in the DEI discussion, it's really important to consider opportunities that exist. And opportunities is something that, at least in this area, we've recognized that, employees want more opportunities for growth. Employees who have been traditionally underrepresented throughout all levels of the public sector are really looking for those opportunities to learn, to grow, to participate, and to help solve some of the problems that exist. And another barrier besides just those opportunities is us really helping employees move away from the position of saying, well, that's just the way we've always done it. And rooting themselves in a position that does not adapt well to change. And I know change can be very stressful and it can be challenging. But again, when we have a diverse workforce, it's been proven in so many ways that any organization, by the mere fact of having that diversity, is much better equipped to tackle a lot of those challenges and problems and actually solve problems that exist.
So true. Yes, thank you all for that. We're gonna kind of switch gears a little bit, slightly from what we were talking about there, and talk a little bit more about how some of these, you know, particularly now, I would love, Risa, your perspective on this being in Portland, but social justice and how these issues are showing up and impacting workplace culture. It's such a unique time right now with the pandemic, with civil unrest, and what are the sort of core, you know, challenges that we see bubbling up in the workplace because of that?
Yes, really twofold, and I'll focus the discussion on, again, just our role in public sector human resources. You know, these social justice issues are huge. You know, we're talking about a global pandemic. It's having an impact on everyone, whether directly or indirectly. The, you know, local unrest, employees are stressed, they're frustrated, they're anxious. People are anxious just in general in the communities, but also employees are very anxious. There are so many unknowns. You know, people want assurances, and it's very difficult to make sure that employees have a lot of the information, that expectations that things will just be okay, you know, is something that's very challenging. So if we take a moment and we step back and we think about our role in public service, it's really about public sector equaling public service. So as a public sector entity, again, our role is to provide services to the public. And the community is not asking, they're demanding that changes be made. No more can we just say, okay, well, you know, we're working on it, we're having discussions, sort of, we'll get to it soon. They are demanding to know what exactly is changing. Employees want to feel like they're in a safe work environment. Members of the community want to feel like they're also safe during this time. And so really,
Lisa, can I just interrupt you for one moment? Sorry. Just if you are not muted, if you could go ahead and mute and turn your camera off, that would be excellent. Go ahead, Risa.
Thank you. Yeah, so really, you know, 2020 is such a unique year, but it's also a year that we recognize is so unique that now there is an appetite for change. You know, there is an opportunity for us as public sector agencies to step back, to reevaluate how we do the work of public service, how perhaps we can make things more efficient, how we can realign or reimagine and reinvent how we actually deliver services. And so, you know, at the City of Portland, we're really taking time to do that. And that's starting at the level of leadership. City council members have partnerships with community members. They've adopted city values. Those values have also been promoted by all of our bureau directors. So, I mean, there is buy-in from leadership. It's definitely essential. It's definitely essential that we connect with our community partners and that we demonstrate the value that we have and that we provide to the community. And that's really at the heart of what we should be about as public sector entities.
Thank you for sharing that. It seems like Portland is really doing some important work in terms of working cross-departmentally, cross-functionally, all of the crosses, you know, that they can in terms of engaging in all of the right conversations. And I think that that's really important because, you know, obviously in many cases with employees, we're talking about, you know, generations of family trauma and so many other things that are so important to pay attention to. I wanted to, in our discussion earlier, we were talking a lot about the unique, you know, the unique factor that in the public sector, there's such a range of employee experiences. And I think it's so interesting to think about that because that also for many people probably on this call. That does include law enforcement. And the dynamic right now between the community and certain parts of the community and law enforcement. I would just love to hear any thoughts on how HR teams might navigate this. It sounds like something Risa shared might be helpful, but Jennifer, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, our sheriff's department is the largest actually department in our county. And, you know, if you don't know where Jefferson County is, we're the western suburbs of Denver. And as with many metro areas, they also are supporting the other cities who have dealt with, you know, more of the things that have been going on, and they've been lending their support to Denver Police and Aurora Police as well. So, you know, I think it's interesting because, you know, we did a lot of focus on listening to employees as one of our go-tos to hear how they were feeling. And I think a key for HR professionals is for us to engage in something we call empathic listening, where you're listening not to you know, win your point, but you're listening to hear the perspective of another person and listen to that perspective and value that perspective. And I think in government, that's critical because we have so many different people with different perspectives, because in HR, we're caring for our law enforcement community just as much as we're caring for everyone else who works there. And they all have a different lens of what they're seeing and what they're working in. And so from HR, we can be empathetic as well, because understanding, you know, from our folks in law enforcement that, you know, people are really judging them. They're hearing some hurtful things as individuals, and they're people in our organization. They're humans too, as well as we have, you know, other employees who've had some interactions with law enforcement or their family has, and they bring something to the table as well. Their perspective and feelings about it are valued. And so what we've really been trying to train and push out in some of our workshops is that empathic listening, so that employees and peers, you can listen to your employees, you can listen to your coworkers, you can listen to the community, and put yourself in their place in order to more effectively communicate and do what needs to be done to improve. Because if we can't listen to each other, we can't work with each other to make things better.
Mm-hmm. It's such a good point. I think sometimes people can be deterred from listening because they're not sure what to do with the information once they have it, and the responsibility of needing to navigate that. So does anybody have any thoughts on that part of it as a next step to the listening component?
I guess I'll keep going then. You know, one of the interesting things that we've been telling people as a next step to listening is, I think in leadership and in HR, we often feel compelled to have the answers and jump to action. And sometimes we're not going to have the answers. And I think it's okay to be vulnerable and admit that, wow, I'm not even sure what to do with that. Let me take that in. Yes. We don't always have to have the answers, I think, is one key component. But I think after you've listened, what we're doing is we're shifting our listening sessions to listen and learn from each other to do sessions. And we're starting to collect information from our employees and the community. Okay, what does this look like for you? This is what you're saying the current state is. What is the future state that you envision? And then what are the ideas you have to get there? You know, is it, you know, we all have assumptions on what those ideas are. And I think some of them are great. And they're focused on, you know, some ideas we've heard are, you know, some of our hiring practices in certain areas, people do not feel like they're as inclusive as they should be. There are people who feel like some departments, while they've gone almost overboard, but they've made too many assumptions on what they think people need and not enough listening, too much action without the listening. So we're really trying to move that to the next level, because I think a lot of times, and I think I'm guilty, and I know probably a lot of us can identify, we do these classes, we do them all the time. It's not like we've never done bias classes and workshops trying to build cultural competency. but rarely do we get small groups together to talk about that action. Okay, so what are we going to do? And that's what we're really trying to pin down now, because I feel like for years we've been, training and talking and listening, but we have never gone that next step in doing the action. And I think for us, what's been helpful is that our elected commissioners were in those listen and learn sessions. And so they heard, it wasn't HR saying this is what's going on. They heard their employees from frontline to people in management ranks talking about their experiences. And for them, I think it was eye-opening. And from there, we're actually able to hire a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager to do the work. Because we've been saying, we don't have the resources we need to take action on some of the things you want to see. But I think in some respects, hearing it firsthand for people in that elected role was a way to provide the impetus we needed to start to take more action, because now we have that true buy-in and support.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Jennifer. We're going to kind of move on to the next section here, which is about caring for our people. But I want to give a chance for Andrea, if there's a question that feels particularly relevant.
Yes, actually, Viva, I have a question that was posted on our chat box, and this participant would like to hear any comments and observations about inter-employee and inter-union conflict around social justice, and if you have any work, if your organization has any work in these areas. I leave that up to the three panelists.
It feels related, Jennifer, to what you were saying about, go ahead, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think, we don't have unions, but, originally when our county manager published a statement, just kind of offering support and care for employees who may be upset and angry about things they were seeing happening in our city and across the country. Initially, we did have some people from law enforcement who said, hey, what about us? Don't you care about us? And we don't have unions in my organization, but I think, we've seen a little bit of that, and we've seen a little bit of employees, we got into a good discussion around the word racism in one of our listening sessions. And there were a few employees who felt upset at the notion that perhaps only people in privilege, and we were talking about white people, might be the ones who could engage in racism, not prejudice, but racism. And they were very upset that we were talking about that whole notion of privilege. And that's presented itself a little bit with other employees in those discussions. But I think for the most part, knock on wood, at this point, what we've seen are people willing to engage in dialogue. Not everyone's there and gotten to the same point of agreement, but people are dialoguing for the most part in a very respectful way. And I think that's growth for everybody. So, I mean, we haven't seen like huge conflict or situations we've had to intervene in, but we have seen dialogue that I think is difficult, but I think that's part of our growth as an organization.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think oftentimes what I've seen more recently, even if the conversations feel so complicated, so uncomfortable, so challenging, there is a sense of relief, I think, in finally being able to have more honest dialogue and there being space for that and not just being expected to be there and to be nice. So thank you so much for that, Jennifer. Kara, I would love, you have so much experience in all of the things that we're talking about here and in so many different organizations. I would love to hear your perspective as a leader, why it's so important for leaders to have strong skills in caring for people. There are a lot of people that are upset right now, that are angry justifiably, that are anxious, as we're talking about. So why is it so important for leaders to have those skills, and like, what's a good place for people to start gaining them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's part of the skill set of a good leader anyway, to learn how to listen and care for their people. And I don't think there's anything special in this situation about that. It's just that you really do have to listen, and you really do have to be open to hearing the pain and the struggle that all of your team is going through. I really see it as being a key part of being a good manager and a good leader. You do have the added impact in the public sector of having so many different leaders, from your elected officials to your agency heads to your department leads. So that can be rather difficult to make sure that you're communicating all the way through and across the chain and making sure everybody understands that it's important to be listening, especially now. I wanted to go back to the global pandemic and the overall question. One of the things I think that gets highlighted a lot now is that not included can be more highlighted at this time, because we're not together. You can't read body language as well. And there are a lot of areas within diversity, because diversity goes beyond race, of course. It includes disability and other issues as well. You know, it can be very difficult on a video screen to really make sure that everyone is being heard and listened to and being cared for. So having more connection points is really important, I think, right now, as much as possible, because you can't rely on being in the same room with people you normally.
Yeah, it's a really important point, being really intentional, right, about the ways in which in which we lead. I like so much what you said about there's nothing really sort of unique in a sense with leading around these topics. I think for me, the thing that stands out is strong leadership skills become even more important when let's talk about the manager relationship, for example. If you're managing someone across difference from you, that is a different race or a different gender, any, kind of aspect of identity, particularly if the person on the other side is a member of a marginalized group, one or more, right? Trust building becomes that much more important, because they've already been marginalized in our society, and trust has been broken more often, right? And so it becomes even more important that you are really intentional about the ways that you build trust, and that you any understanding that any infraction on that trust is also going to do far more damage than it would do for somebody in maybe a different situation. So I think those are some really important points. Andrea, are there questions there that you want to throw one out, maybe?
Yeah, yes, there's actually a question that was sent out to everyone. They were interested in learning whether our HR peers believe that when we're having these chat sessions, whether an outside facilitator is necessary. And your opinions on that.
I can share my thoughts on that, but I would love to hear if someone, Risa looks like she wants to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, at the City of Portland, we've taken a couple of different approaches. One, the city itself has an Office of Equity and Human Rights, and a Director of Equity, essentially that is set up to be sort of separate and almost independent as an objective resource for the city. And so that Office of Equity and Human Rights has initiated discussions within the city with employees, created safe spaces to do that, but also within the bureaus themselves within the city. Leadership has taken a responsibility to, again, reach out, encourage managers, supervisors of their units to have some safe spaces, some core time just for some basic communication, to ask that those sessions not be recorded, to respect those who participate, to listen empathetically, not to try to necessarily come up with a response or a reply or to pass judgment in any way or to feel as if they're being judged. And then thirdly, our wellness coordinators have also taken time to reach out to employees of color to provide a broader safe space within the city. So that support has come in different ways. If a bureau would like to, they can solicit maybe a third-party contract to have an outsider come in, but essentially we have equity managers embedded with the city that are essentially serving in a similar role, that have been supporting and leading that type of work.
I would add too, you know, I think my go-to has always been an outside facilitator, but we wanted to do something timely, and sometimes, you know, by the time you get a contract and find the right person, something's not timely anymore. So 3 people from our HR team actually led our listen and learn sessions, and they had a little bit of content and then opened it up for dialogue. And people were quiet at first, and they shared some of their own experiences. And what I would say, for the most part, in reading surveys and feedback that employees have provided to us, is I think it provided this opportunity for human resources to show up as human. That, you know, we too have experiences as humans. We too may experience things in the workplace and in the community. And they were all very different experiences. And what we heard is that people really appreciated that. So it wasn't, we weren't talking at people. Like I said, I think sometimes it feels like we were part of our workforce at that time, and we were just sharing in a safe space, not recorded, our experience. Everyone had the opportunity to share something that they've experienced, or how they've experienced, or how they're feeling. And I think for us, it really is able to help influence our relationship in a more human way, in a more people-centered way going forward. And now for some of our sessions that we're going to continue on, we are bringing in facilitators. So kind of to Teresa's point, we're also doing a mix. But I think, you know, in trying to do something timely and trying to show that vulnerability and trying to come together as a, you know, build that connection. You know, we're not together right now because we're also remote. It really kind of brought a lot of our employees together. We had over 200 employees out of our 3,000 on one group. So it built that sense of community that I think an outside facilitator might not have been able to accomplish.
It's a great point. Yeah, I think it is a balance. It's so unique to any team, to any group. I would say just be really mindful of who is in the driver's seat of those conversations, and that it is somebody that is well versed in, you know, emotional intelligence and navigating, facilitating conversations like that. The most important thing is to not do more undue harm to marginalized groups within those conversations. So really framing it in a way where people understand the agreements of that space, I think. And it can, because it can do, I've seen it happen where, you know, the centering of white guilt or, you know, that sort of thing can come up a lot in those spaces. Understandably, everybody's in different places with it. But I think it can be really difficult for me, let's say, as a Black woman, to sit in a conversation where the first 25 minutes is really all about the white perspective, right, on what's happening right now. So just be mindful of those. And there are tons of resources out there online about restorative justice, healing circles. You know, Teaching Tolerance is a really good website to check out as well.
And Viva, if I may,
yes,
you know, one other thing that we've been strongly encouraging employees to do is to take time and recognize that it starts with each of us as individuals, and the importance of taking time to learn and to do the work, to take some introspective time ourselves and really focus our attention. I think, as Jennifer was mentioning, you know, just to be mindful about experiences, you know, open your mind to learn, ask yourself why. Do that hard work of learning what some of your implicit biases may be, because it is very draining for employees who are not in the majority to have to continually share their stories, to have to be the ones that people turn to and ask for solutions. it's really bigger than just one person. It's bigger than one particular group or race of people. This is a shared problem. This is a shared opportunity that we have to develop our organizational aptitude when it comes to diversity and equity and inclusion. And it really is something that we're stressing. It's important to keep learning. And it's okay. You know, we don't expect everyone to learn and to know everything all at once, but just to have that appetite for continual learning, I think will go very far long after a DEI expert, let's say, comes in from the outside and then leaves.
Sure.
Where does that leave your organization?
Definitely. We're talking about sustainable change here. And so nobody's going to come in and do a one and done training and for there to be sustainable change from that, right? Kara, you look like you wanted to add something.
I just wanted to emphasize that one of the things that IPMA-HR did recently was revise our HR 2020 report, and we talked about urgency and accountability. But one of the things that I think Risa just said, and I know Jennifer said it as well, everyone is accountable. And you have to recognize that everyone is part of this solution. So being accountable is not just the HR department or the HR lead. All of us have accountability, and we're acting with urgency. The other thing I just wanted to throw out there as a takeaway too to think about is that there are other institutions and community organizations that can be very helpful in this discussion. So it's not necessarily a facilitator, but there's so many on the ground groups within your communities, or even maybe your educational institutions or others that can really be there as partners with you. So, and you know, of course, organizations like mine and IPMA-HR Western Region, but you know, those are things to not forget about. You're not alone. Everyone's accountable. Everyone has to do the work, but you're not by yourself.
No, it's such an important point, Kara. I love that you shared that because they also, because you all are in the public sector, they have a vested interest in wanting your success, right? Because that's shared success that impacts everyone. So I think it's a really important point. We're going to kind of get into our last category here. We're already sort of talking about it, and I know that there are a lot of questions in the chat. But one of the things that I wanted to just ask as sort of almost a little bit of a counter to what Risa and I were kind of alluding to or talking about is that perspective of being a marginalized person or underrepresented person in these conversations. But how do you approach this work if you are somebody that holds personal privilege, right, from a racial or a gender perspective? Like, what is the thing that the lens you should have when entering into sort of this next phase of where do we go from here?
Well, I am a person of color, but I'll take a crack at it. I think one of the ways you can do it is to really look at listen. You have to listen, but really also an action you can take is to start looking at your policies and your programs and your practices and really go beyond, have I hired a diverse workforce, to thinking about, are my retirement benefits, my health benefits, the way I talk about organizational capacity, the way I talk about you know, urgency around different policies and practices. Am I really thinking about all of the different communities that I have on my team? Am I being inclusive enough? Is the employee handbook written in such a way that brings people in instead of really not doing that, supposedly, you know? And so you utilize your resource groups if you have them, talk to those groups, get input from the community. Those are some actions that I would recommend that people could think about. And of course, the one we started with, which is to look at your own implicit biases and your unconscious biases.
It's so true, right? Because we're talking a lot about racial privilege right now, understandably, because of obviously the history of our global history and the history of our nation. But thinking about, I know something I've been trying to focus on a lot is just, even though I'm a woman of color, a Black woman, what are the other ways in which I even hold privilege, although it might be to varying degrees, right? I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, English-speaking woman. So I think it's important, yes, for everyone to kind of think about it is a spectrum of privilege, right? When we talk about that, so makes a lot of sense. Jennifer, do you have something to share?
Yeah, I think everything that you just shared is spot on, and some other things that I'm taking from the cue of what employees shared with each other of what they needed from each other in some of our community groups. And they said what they really want from their coworkers is for you to also speak up. That you know, when you hear something or see something, or you're with a group and they're saying something disparaging, whether it's about women or a minority group or some people are disabled, and you're in that group and no one from those groups being talked about is there, are you going to speak up for us and say that's wrong, that's not how we talk about our coworkers or our community members, or are you just going to laugh along? And so I know that's always hard. It's hard for all of us, right? But that's just one of the key things that I think people want from their coworkers is being willing to be that advocate, whether it is with policies and dollars and interviewing practices, but also just in those day-to-day conversations that come up in the workplace or in the grocery store. You know, being willing to let people know that those things are not accepted and not acceptable.
Right. It's a really good point. And I think what hinders people sometimes from doing that is not having the words in the moment to feel like they can do that. So whatever you can do to help people hear 4 phrases, 3 phrases you can say in moments like this, because that is most important when it comes to cultivating a culture of belonging within your organization. So I know we have a lot of questions, I think, in the chat, and we wish we had 3 hours, but we're running low on time. So Andrea, do you have another question that might be helpful for a large group of people here?
Yes, there's actually a question that was posed about how do I help or be part of the solution as someone who is white, although a woman, and LGBT. So a different perspective from somebody who is, as we would as most have been said, is in a position of privilege. Although they're a woman and LGBT as well, so that's not really complete privilege either. So.
Yeah, intersectionality, right? It's kind of what we were talking about in terms of everybody it's a spectrum for everyone, right? In different ways that we hold privilege. Yeah, it's a really good question. Does anybody have an immediate thought around that?
I have one minor thought I'll try to share. I went to an interesting session a few years back that was talking about kind of that woman-on-woman crime. That sometimes when, as women from that segment, when there are few leadership slots, that sometimes we're hesitant to help other women as well because we feel there's not enough for us to go around. And so I think, you know, just again, that piece of advocating for everyone, advocating for good talent, advocating for good employees, whether they're women or LGBTQ or people of color or, you know, whatever those things are. Just being that advocate for an inclusive environment, no matter where we see it, is important for all of us, and especially in human resources. But it was an interesting session I was in about just some of the women dynamics that sometimes we have to be sponsors and mentors for each other, and helping build that gender dynamic. I was just on a city and county manager session, which is why I kind of was having technical difficulties transitioning over. And as many of you know, there's not a large female or people of color representation in that group. So I think, you know, those are key areas where we can advocate for each other.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jennifer. I know that there are so many questions that people want to have time to ask, and we're getting down to our last couple of minutes here. And I just want to make sure to underscore a couple of things that have come up during our conversation. And that is really making sure to engage with your employees and really learn and come from a place of listening to the range of perspectives that are represented within your workforce. Kara had a great point around creating greater transparency, especially because we're talking about public sector. So it is really important that people have access to the things that you are talking about. Even if you're not sure yet, say, we're not sure, but we're trying to figure it out. That feels really important too. And I want to just kind of go back to accountability, because we are all accountable for our own learning, obviously. And no matter who you are on this call, most people are HR professionals, but it is my belief that in order to create sustainable change, the people that have to be ultimately accountable in terms of their work performance for what this looks like is really leadership within an organization. And so anything that you can do to kind of like push forward that degree of how does this get amplified to being an annual goal, a part of our strategy, right? And looking at it from that lens versus it's this standalone thing that we're just doing to help people feel good about our organization. So those are the couple things that come to mind. Does anybody else have any final thoughts around that? And we can talk about what's going to happen next. Great. I will just go ahead and share. I really appreciated this conversation, this dialogue. I deeply apologize if we didn't have time to get to your question. If it's possible, Andrea, if there's a way that you can copy everything that's in the chat and put it in an email to the panelists, hopefully we can find a way to make sure if there are burning questions that we want to make sure to answer, that we have an opportunity to do that. As I talked about, this is not the last time IPMA is going to be talking about all of this. We're going to be sending a survey out within the next week or so that's going to just kind of connect with you on, you know, what you took away from this time and generate some you know, some feedback around what are the types of topics related to DEI that you'd like to hear more about in the future, potentially a couple of course offerings if there's demand for it, to kind of get more into the tactical components of our discussion today. We would love for you to connect with us on LinkedIn. So here are all of our names. We've appreciated the time that you've spent with us. Andrea, do you have any final thoughts to share?
Yes, just the final announcements. Western Region is committed to continuing these conversations, and as Viva said, we will be continuing with at least a couple more conversations like this. So be on the lookout for additional emails that will tell you about how to register and all. We are all in time change, and as Kara was saying, you know, there's an urgency and accountability for the things that we are doing right now. Western Region would like you to know, you can still connect with us, and we are trying to provide more opportunities. If we don't all get together as a region, you can get together with your chapters as well. You could also look at the national. We've got a whole lot of webinars that are going on, just so you don't feel like you're doing this all on your own. You're not alone. Having come from a small agency where you're the single HR person, you're not alone. There's a whole bunch of us, and we'll all get through this together. So with that, if there's no other final thoughts, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.